Okay, so I guess it's my turn. Okay. I'm sorry to have missed this morning, so I'm not exactly sure how things are going to go, or how things are supposed to go. But let me sort of begin by trying to elaborate this concept of care. I should say that my study of the politics of care is not something that I sort of have always been interested in. It is something that I came to study as I was doing research on my last book, and it became really important because it was really, really important to people in movement spaces. And so I tried to figure out what that sort of meant politically, and I realized in the course of trying to figure that out that actually the tools that we have to understand care in political theory are relatively thin. And so, so I set out trying to think about a politics of care, and today what I present to you is as far as I've gotten so far. I want to talk about care and why it's a politics, but then I also finish with a kind of meditation on the place of vulnerability in a politics of care, which is a little bit of a new piece. So I look forward to your feedback about that as well, because it's the newest part and the part that I need to know the most about from you all. Okay. Care has been organized out of politics in Western Enlightenment traditions. Neither liberalism nor socialism in their traditional 19th and 20th century forms have understood care as important parts of public life. Indeed, in both traditions, when care is thought of at all, it is thought to properly be undertaken off the public stage, largely out of the public eye, an element of life that is alongside and often beneath the abstract principles and interest-based economic motives that are the proper province of public life. The affect, labor, necessity, and genius of care, which is wholly responsible for the maintenance of all life, as well as the basis for any possible sociality which may lead to society or politics, is obscured from view. Constructed as private, emotional, and apolitical, it is identified with the feminine, racialized, and put in the category of nature, dependence, and low skill. At best, care has been identified by socialist feminists as a form of labor or discussed as one of the constellation of social forces behind the hidden abode, as Nancy Fraser has put it, that is a condition of the possibility for capitalist accumulation, commodification, and system functioning. However, these dominant views of care have left our polities and societies unwell. There is precarity at almost every level. In addition to worsening survival and health outcomes in the US and other rich countries, the trending of people's lived experience in a negative direction has led to the reinvigoration and re-legitimation of politics that frankly and explicitly deny the possibility of plural, egalitarian, democratic societies. Indeed, everywhere we turn is a purported crisis of care. This crisis is often represented as the demise of the welfare state, specifically the lack in accessibility, unaffordability, racism, and coloniality of various kinds of care, particularly child and elder care or care for the ill. But we can see it in many more places. The disinvestment in infrastructure, the cutting back of resources for education at all levels, the lack of interest in consumer rights and experiences across industries as the phase of capitalism has moved from one of service to one of financialization. But the crisis is constitutive. As Neve Gordon and Catherine Rottenberg point out, quote, the current reign of carelessness informing the political and economic spheres is the result of histories of colonial, imperialist, misogynist, and white supremacist violence, compounded by now decades of intensified neoliberal policies and the reduction of ever more domains of our society and lives to market logic, end quote. This is what happens in a society where we have banished the basic precondition for all life, subject formation and intersubjective relation, to a marginal position outside the direct concern of our formation of collectivities and communities, our rulemaking, and our governance. A politics of care, by contrast, is an orientation toward what Christopher Paul Harris calls collective self-fashioning, that takes its central remit and purpose to be understanding, investing in, and providing the means for the care that is always required for life. Importantly, the politics of care takes as given the fact that all life is in relation, The autonomous, independent subject is a theoretical fiction that does not reflect the reality of life in the world where the individual is always already in context. And thus, interdependence, rather than independence or dependence, is the scale that is most relevant to both well-being and justice. It is also the scale that is appropriate for the politics of care. In this way, the politics of care both presents us with and demands a new purpose for politics and new possibilities for living together. There have, of course, been strands of this way of thinking all along. Black feminist philosophers have always understood care as both a form of ethical life and a politics, as an alternative ground for the organization of society, politics, and economics. Audre Lorde observes in her essay, "The Master's Tools Will Never Dismantle the Master's House," that, quote, "interdependency is the way to a freedom which allows the I to be, not in order to be used, but in order to be creative," end quote. In Western patriarchal traditions, interdependence is either a description of a capitalistic distribution of labor that is inevitably racialized and hierarchical, or is considered a threat, a stopover on the road to dependence, which is the antithesis in that framework to freedom. Care is organized out of politics in these traditions because it cannot be perceived as mutual, intersubjective, worthy work undertaken between people relating, as Lorde puts it, quote, "within equality." The relation within equality is not aggregation of individuals who share common characteristics of advantage that philosophers will then name universal. It is instead a dynamic relation between people who exist in context, who are born into different experiences, structured by the world as it is before they arrive, and yet inevitably impacted by their arrival, by the poetry they imagine, by the action they may take to disrupt and reshape their context, its systems, structures, institutions, and mores. Alexis Pauline Gumbs argues that life-giving actions, what she calls radical mothering, are at the heart of the Black feminist project of care. She believes Black feminism has positively politicized mothering, disconnecting it from biology, the female body, or even kinship, and instead defining it as, quote, "the practice of creating, nurturing, affirming, and supporting life," end quote. In her version of a politics in which care is the central organizing principle, Gumbs reframes the question of politics so that one is compelled to ask, what is the most life-giving choice? What is the most nourishing choice? What is the choice that will sustain us for the long term? That's a quote. It may seem peculiar to think of nourishing care as a central question for politics. Can this kind of care stand shoulder to shoulder with freedom and equality? Can life-giving conceptually go toe-to-toe with justice? The Black feminist tradition would ask, why not? In terms of the maintenance of society and economy, in terms of moral suasion and productivity, there is nothing inherent to the notions that underpin Western liberalism that make them more important or better guiding questions than those set forth by these Black feminist thinkers who have always been most concerned with how one can make a world in which aliveness, self-determination, reciprocal community, and joy are possible even for those who are, quote, "never meant to survive," end quote. As I elaborate the politics of care, it is important to keep in mind how care can also be, and has also been, weaponized as paternalism, domination, and even lethal violence. Indeed, most of the institutions in current American society which purport to be in the business of caring for the vulnerable, like the child welfare system, homeless shelters, or temporary homes for victims of domestic violence, among many others, do anything but care, burdening people in need of nourishing care with scrutiny, exclusion, demands for the performance of perfect victimhood and compliance, as well as resources too limited to meet their needs, even if and after such performances are achieved. As Miriam Ticktum's work has illustrated, liberal forms of care, of political care, like welfare and humanitarianism, are often premised on a notion of hierarchy and deservingness, in which the exclusion of the unqualified or undeserving, however and by whomever that is defined, are of paramount importance, often eclipsing in both orientation and cost the provision of aid. That is, and this, I have to say, putting on my hat as an empiricist always burns me right up, is that actually it costs so much more money to police care than to just render it. So it is performed under this mythology of efficiency that is absolutely not satisfied. And so it's particularly upsetting to me as someone who both likes to theorize and can count. Sorry, that's a side rant, but okay. The care of liberal states is often necropolitical care, a set of policies motivated by narrow moral sentiment, backed with ever-shrinking material investment, and built for the purpose of deciding whose lives matter and whose lives do not, who to let live and who to make die, with the consequences of those actions laying out in racialized, gendered, and global patterns that are too familiar to social scientists to bear repeating. The long train of abuses, to borrow a phrase, have been compounding for hundreds of years and have yielded more than enough evidence, which only continues to accumulate, that the organization of modernity has limits that cannot be overcome by the dominant principles or practices of liberal capitalist heteropatriarchy. It is time to head in a different direction, to be guided by a different set of values, which may birth a different kind of politics, a politics for a new age. I believe the politics of care should be the basis for this new politics, this politics toward futurity. However, let me be clear, I do not mean to idealize a politics of care as entirely outside current systems and therefore a pure alternative to the messiness, conflict, and contests for power that are at the heart of collective self-governance. There is nothing that can save us from that, and we don't need to be saved. It is what politics is, and it is not negative or impure to want power or organize for its taking. What is at issue is the way those contests are organized and what they are organized for. Putting the concept of care at the center of politics is not merely a nice thing to do, it is a realignment of political thinking that has the generative potential of enabling us to transgress the limits of modernity and build a 21st century politics that begins to unmake things that seem eternal, like white supremacy, patriarchy, and capitalism as we have known them. Let me emphasize here that I do not speak of utopia. I never speak of utopia, and I am not interested in it. Even if those I am aligned with win, the win will be partial, not total. There are always remainders. However, what we can do is establish new common sense and work to enable systemic and institutional transformations that will be great improvements on the ones we have inherited. We will know this not because their design is more pristine or efficient, but because more people in more places will be able to live more flourishing lives. This is what it means to progress. But even the new systems, the fruit of militant and pragmatic imagination, will produce their own pattern vexations, some of which will be incompatible with the political values that they profess. The hope is that these injustices of the new world are different than that of the old, that progress means different problems. As Octavia Butler says, quote, "There is no end to what a living world will demand of you," end quote. Likewise, there is no end of history and no end of politics. The nature of collective self-fashioning is that it is a continuous endeavor, reinvigorated and reimagined across generations for their own purposes and in their own times. Instead of utopia, I am speaking of what it takes to shape change, as Butler puts it, to push the world into a new historical epoch. For me, this is what critical inquiry is and means. It is not only the diagnosis of problems beyond the normative explanations offered by liberal Western traditions, and it is certainly not limited to explicating the implications of Marxian concepts, even with global and anti-colonial modifications. It is the serious undertaking of understanding the world as it is for the purpose of building something new and better. In my view, critical inquiry is a kind of research that is the basis for action because it reveals the distance between the given and the necessary. So in terms of the concept of care, I just want to tell you what I learned from organizers and movement. As I was interviewing organizers in the Black Lives Matter movement, one of the things that struck me as both unique and puzzling was the emphasis people put on both healing and care. As an activist who'd been present in movement spaces frequently 10 years prior to the uprising in Ferguson, that just means I am old and my activism took place the decade previous to that, I found this focus on people's affect and emotional well-being really new. In addition, there was a professed respect for and appreciation of the knowledges encoded in emotion and the body, not as distinct from the cognition of the mind, but inseparable from it. This was accompanied by valuing the needs people had, physical, emotional, and spiritual, outside and beyond their capacity for productivity. And these commitments weren't only rhetorical or matters of movement etiquette, they were rooted in research. The recovery and utilization of Black feminist texts by Audre Lorde, Octavia Butler, Toni Cade Bambara, James Baldwin, and others, as well as the structure of the organizations, which boasted healing justice directors, councils, and committees who were responsible for creating policies and practices toward well-being in organizations, adjudicating conflict and disputes, and adding their guidance to shaping and executing campaigns. Having been trained as a traditional political scientist before the effective turn in political theory and interdisciplinary political studies, I found myself ill-equipped to interpret the significance of these changes. So I went first to definitions, and then to the genealogies of care in feminist, Black feminist, and socialist feminist political theory. In terms of definition, care is a concept with polyvalent meanings. As Emily Kenway writes, care is promiscuous. That's a quote. When we say we care, we may be referencing an idea, a person, or a cause. We may care for children, elders, animal companions, the environment, or ourselves. We may take care with processes and procedures, with cultural mores or aesthetic arrangements. Care has both noun and verb forms. The first is a disposition toward providing what is necessary for health, welfare, maintenance, or protection of someone or something of serious attention and consideration. The second is the activity of caring for, both in terms of internal impetus and external labor. It is the feeling of concern and the attachment of importance to a person, place, or thing, as well as the task one undertakes in ensuring that needs are met. In the case of people in the Black Lives Matter movement, care is highlighted as both a guiding ethic and a politics because it is the reason for political action. We must care because people matter. So let us pause to consider this. By its primary definition, to matter is just to exist as physical substance that has mass at rest. It also means to be of importance or significance, to have content and substance that is distinct from manner and form. That is, what we are matters. It is not a matter of what we do. A matter is also an affair under consideration, the reason for distress, the pus that seeps from a wound. One does not earn the properties of substance and significance through motivation or via avocation. One is not granted this ability to matter by right. One is not granted this ability to matter by right. There may be explanations and reasons why we matter, but no justification is required. We simply matter, and so we deserve care. It took me a long time to understand how fundamental this notion is to the current movement for Black liberation, and in the end, it was actually a personal experience that helped me to illuminate this concept of care. But before I tell you that story, I need to know how much time I have.
10 minutes.
10 minutes, okay.
11.
Okay. Okay. I just needed to know that it wasn't about to end in the middle of the story. Okay, so personal experience. To understand the status of care and movement, I had to study the texts that people in the movement were referencing. So I had read Audre Lorde in passing in graduate school, but I had not understood her. And in the discipline for which I was being trained, there was really no need to understand her. However, to understand the movement, it was clear that I would have to return to her words. During the fall of 2020, I was trying to make sense of Lorde's political lessons and the ways that they were reflected in the politics of care articulated and practiced in the movement. I was compiling my interview notes and trying to make them into a book. It was also the moment when many schools around the country were shut down. I am the mother of 2 children, and they were at home with me nearly all the time. My partner had been called back to in-person work, and so it was an often tense negotiation between me, my children, their online schooling, and my writing. Social events were few and far between, and on one occasion, an outdoor get-together of a local grade school, of the local grade school children had been planned. The day of the event arrived with dark skies and vigorous thunderstorms. The gathering was canceled. My kids were upset at this, particularly my then 10-year-old son, who would have been surrounded by kids his own age for the first time in months. I sat with him for a few minutes that morning, expressed my disappointment, and invited him to express his, made sure he ate his breakfast, and that it was one he enjoyed, set him up on his laptop and logged into one of the many makeshift school-related apps, and then disappeared into my office to write. I thought he was okay. But soon, and uncharacteristically, he began to fight with his then 6-year-old sister. Shortly after that conflict was diffused, he started doing something that caused loud thumping and crashing noises. Later, he went to make himself a snack and spilled blueberries and shredded cheese all over the kitchen floor. After each incident, which for me was mere interruption, I came out of my office and away from my work to correct, redirect, and clean up. Finally, after lunchtime, my son just broke down into incoherent tears. I comforted him with hugs, but he seemed inconsolable. After about a half an hour of what I quietly considered to be rather inconvenient tantrum, I finally said, "Look, there's nothing to be done. The weather is the weather. Sometimes things don't go to plan." This, which was to me a simple statement of fact, seemed to infuriate my child. He ran up to his room and shut the door. However, the house was finally quiet. My daughter was playing contentedly on her own, and so I went back to work. But my work was coincidentally Audre Lorde's essay, Man-Child, a Black lesbian feminist response. In the essay, Lorde is working through the difficulties of Black mothering. That is, the deep and devoted caring for a Black adolescent boy who you know is disproportionately unsafe in the world as it is. In the essay, she reflects, quote, "It is as hard for our children to believe that we are not omnipotent as it is for us to know it as parents. But that knowledge is necessary as the first step in the reassessment of power as something other than might, age, privilege, or lack of fear. It is an important step for a boy whose societal destruction begins when he is forced to believe that he can only be strong if he doesn't feel," end quote. Working with these texts, I couldn't stop thinking of my child, how uninterested I was in his upset because there was nothing to fix. I could not instantly make the situation right, and so I wanted him to get over it, to deny his hurt and move on, or at least to stop expressing that hurt so loudly and destructively, as there was nothing I could do to change the weather. As an aside, and incidentally, weathering is the name of a medical concept coined by Dr. Arlene Geronimus, which refers to the changes the biology of people subjected to oppression undergoes. It's the acceleration of the aging process at the cellular level, which makes people more susceptible to infection and the early onset of chronic diseases. So, double entendre for weather. Okay. But then I had a realization which arose from my worry and my work and my love, and a phrase popped into my head that thrummed inside me, and it was desperate to be spoken. The power of my realization reverberated through me, pushed me up and out of my chair, and made me hurry to my son's room. I found him sitting on his bed, unenthusiastically playing with a fidget toy, his shoulders hunched, his disappointment very clear in his body and drawn face. He looked up at me warily, no doubt thinking I would demand an attitude adjustment. Instead, I said, "I'm sorry. It matters that you are hurting. It simply matters. Whatever the reason, however close and obvious or far and obscure the solutions, your pain matters to me because that's what it means to care." This is a truth that applies both personally and politically. Even if the causes are beyond our control, Even if we can't transform the circumstances and repair the damage immediately, even if the origin of the hurt does not directly arise from an injustice against your person, it simply matters because our lives matter, without justification or explanation or need for a declaration of rights or an account of deservingness. When I said this to my child, his whole face, his whole body unclenched a little, every aspect lifted. He didn't say anything, but he let me hug him without resisting, and a pathway to a better day, to comfort and support, to redress and more creative solutions opened. Pondering Lord's work and its intersection with this personal experience, I started to wonder, what if we have been conceiving of power in an extremely limited fashion, one that limits our ability to create political and economic formations that foster our thriving, one that prevents us from thinking of the solutions that can help us get out of the vexations of the 20th century? What if power is not only force, power over, or influence, power to, or the ability to set agendas via ideological training or political advantage, hegemonic or persuasive power, but also power via connection, power via the formation of identity, and power via community building, that is, power with. Maybe that's what the utility of vulnerability is, the mechanism by which we're able to connect with other people. Maybe it is the mechanism that Audre Lorde is referring to in her essay, The Uses of the Erotic, when she describes the unexpected and powerful possibilities that open via what she calls self-connection shared. This is because this capacity overcomes the, quote, the fear that we cannot grow beyond whatever distortions we may find within ourselves, end quote. This fear, she says, keeps us docile, loyal, and obedient, externally defined, and leads us to accept many facets of our oppression. This is the fear that says it is what it is and allows it to be the end of an argument. However, vulnerability, that self-connection shared, opens a path beyond that fear because it is a way out of isolation. In a world properly understood, where interdependence is acknowledged as not only a social fact, but as a condition for flourishing and justice, we would understand that vulnerability is not only or primarily a state, but a communication technique, a skill set for connection, and the key to building power with.